Hey folks, Knox with IT Inspired here. We are continuing the SQL journey where we are going to be talking about some basic DBA functions. Today we are going to cover not only logins, how to create new users for the SQL server, but as well as go through an actual database migration where we are going to migrate it from the SQL server that we originally set up to a new SQL server so that we can set up a backup schedule on that new SQL server. Why don't we just dive right in and get started, huh? Okay, so logins. This is a huge part of a DBA's role. Who is allowed access to the SQL server? And then from there, what databases are they allowed? And what roles do they fill? What are they allowed to do while they're there? This is super common and super important to get right, but it's not hard, so I will walk you through the process. Okay, we are back in our environment. I've got SSMS pulled up here. We are in an Active Directory environment, so I'm going to show you a lot of how that works. Chances are you're going to be working with an Active Directory environment too, but in case you're not, we're going to do a little bit of both, so it's going to be okay. So as you can see, when we log in, we've got the SQL server right here that we're looking at. This is the server level objects and the server level items. You can actually see if you expand, like there's management where there would be policies that you can implement. Here we can control replication to other SQL servers. You kind of get the idea. This is where a lot of the server side is managed, not necessarily the applications or the data itself. So the first layer that a user has to break through to get into a SQL server is just be allowed to log into the SQL server at all. And where we control that is under the security function here. And then within this, you can see there's a logins, and guess what we're trying to work with? We're trying to work with logins, right? But an important aspect to it is what role are they going to fulfill? So before you make your login, you need to know what their role is. And a lot of these guys, you can just look at the name and tell what they do. The sysadmin, this is the guy who has total keys to the kingdom. They can do whatever they want on the SQL server. Now, the big thing to keep in mind here is we're not talking about what are they allowed to do on the database. We're talking about what are they allowed to do on the server. We haven't talked about the database features yet. We're still on the server roles. So who can create database? Who can edit disk files, which is a part of it? Who can edit logins and what their permissions are on the SQL server? The server admin itself is kind of like the sysadmin. They execute a lot of commands through T-SQL rather than SSMS. Really, the two items that you're going to be looking at, especially in a lab environment, you're going to be looking at sysadmin for yourself, where you're going to have total keys to the kingdom and make any edits that you want, and public, which is where you just want a user to log in, be able to view the database, and then control what they can do in the database themselves. For instance, a report writer, we wouldn't want them creating databases or editing our disks or doing any sort of server setup. We would just want to give them the public role and then control their access in the database itself. So taking that a step further, let's expand databases and show you what I'm talking about. We can expand databases, and guess what? There's a security section within the database. And then there's roles here. So these show you what the person can do to the database itself once they've logged into the SQL server. These are also pretty straightforward. Data reader, that's someone who can read the data. Data writer, that's someone who can write to the data. The security admin, who can edit what the roles and logins are on the SQL database itself. Then, of course, there's denies, which those are obvious what they do. They stop you from reading or writing. They're explicitly denied. And the DB owner is the person who it's the sysadmin of the database, essentially. They have total keys to the kingdom for that specific database. So it is possible for someone to be in the SQL Server public role and a DB owner of maybe this database, like MyPartyDB, and explicitly denied from viewing the AdventureWorks DB. What would a scenario be in a real world? Well, maybe we don't want the salesperson to have access to the HR database. We want them to have access to the sales database. There's two separate databases for that. We're going to control their levels on the database, but we are going to give them the public access to the server level itself. Okay, so Let's kind of minimize these a little bit and walk through creating a user. Guess what? This is pretty straightforward if you're an SSMS. You just right-click on New Login, and let's do SQL Server Authentication, and we'll give this username a user, my test user. How about that? And give them a password. I'm sure that'll be fine. So right here under this select a page, we go to server roles. And you know what? I'm okay with leaving this as public for right now. And user mapping, this is where you can select what database you want them to show up under. Let's choose my party DB, and let's give them DB owner access to that my party DB. So they're only public here under the server, but they're DB owner of my party DB. And now watch this. Let's go back and do that scenario we were talking about earlier. And choose this. And let's do deny data reader. So that guy can't see anything, right? So we've got deny data reader on AdventureWorks and allowed the owner of the my party DB. All right, that sounds good. I'm going to click OK. And look at that. We've got a new user created. What about Windows login? So we are going to create a login now for a Windows-based user. For instance, let's pull up Active Directory. I've got Active Directory here, and I'm just going to create a new user real quick. How about this? We'll call this a SQL test, and we'll call it SQL test. Ooh, got to spell it right, though. That's important. And just give it a password. Sure, that'll work. Finish. So now what I want to do is I am going to start a new query. And see, it's got me on the master database. That's where this stuff is going to take place. That's perfectly fine. Let's do create login. I'm going to do a little open brace here and give it my domain name, username, from Windows. So what's happening here is we're just going to create a login, domain, / username from Windows. That's going to create a domain-based Windows authentication login. Let's hit execute or F5. Command completed successfully. Let's refresh our list. And there it is. This also works with groups. So for instance, I could do create login Stormwind domain admins from Windows. Highlight that. F5. Command completed successfully. And let's refresh. And look at that. You can actually see it shows the little group symbol here instead of that individual person. So that's great. I've created these users on the server itself, but they haven't been mapped. They don't have any roles either, right? So you can then hit properties, go into server roles, give it, sysadmin, and then show up here, go to your security users, and let's add this user that we just made here. So this dialog box is a little bit different, right? So we've already created the login down here. So this is going to be a SQL user with a login. That username, we'll give it the same username that we had before, SQL test. In the login name, guess what? It's going to show the ones that we've just created. We'll just check that box and hit OK. Default schema, anything right here is really fine. How about just DBO? That'll work just perfect since that's pretty much the DBO of everything. Membership, let's DB owner. Cool, that'll be good. And hit OK. Look at that. So now that user would be able to not only log into the server, but they'd also be able to log into the MyPartyDB and browse around through there. Okay, that is a very quick crash course on SQL logins and authentication, doing it two different ways with Active Directory and the SQL Server. Now, what we want to do at this point, I am going to segue into the backups in a later video, but you can't really do backups the best way possible on SQL Server Express. SQL Server Express doesn't come with the SQL agent, and thus it doesn't have maintenance plans under management. That's going to make more sense in the next video. But what I want to do is I want to migrate my MyParty database that I made here to a SQL server that does have that functionality. So I already spun up a virtual machine and installed SQL Server Developer Edition on a different machine. Let me just show you how that looks real quick. Let me just minimize this. We'll do the connect again, and I'm just going to squeeze right in here and do SQL Dev Test 1. That's the name of the machine I created. So you can see here, look at a lot more features, right? Here's this agent I was talking about. This is what we want to migrate our stuff to. But one of the issues that you have with migrating this database over, if you expand security and you're looking at these users, well, guess what? This Stormwind SQL test, that exists here in the SQL Server logins down here. But if I show you what it looks like under the dev test, guess what? That login, it doesn't exist. So we got some issues here. We're going to have to migrate our and this my test user especially, we're going to have to migrate these users over to the other SQL Server, and particularly where there's SQL Server accounts and not Active Directory accounts. Getting those passwords right is a big deal too. It's not just good enough to create a username on the other side if you don't know the password. So SQL has a little workaround, if you will, to get your SQL servers moved over to a new SQL server. Get those logins moved over. Let me bring us over here and show you. So just a very quick search for SQL Server Migrate Security. This will be one of the very first results that come up, and this is what you're going to want to do. I'm going to go with method 2, right here. Yep. I have done this before in production environments. It absolutely works. So let me show you how to do this. Right here on a new query window, copy this following script. This script is big, so you're just going to want to copy the whole thing all the way down to the go. And I'm going to right click and copy. And on the old SQL Server, I'm just going to close this query window and bring up a new query window, paste in the script, and hit execute. Look at that, command completed successfully. And I'm going to bring up another new query window and go back. And what that did is it created a stored procedure essentially that's going to pull out those logins with a hash of their passwords. So all we have to do is execute this stored procedure, which you learned about in the last video, just to pull up that information. Let's paste it in here, run it, and check it out. Look at that. See, it actually creates a script of the logins to create. So in this particular case, I know I need the SQL test login. So on the new server, I'm going to click on the new server and start a query, and paste it. I'm going to go back and I'm going to get that MySQL test user that I created too. How about that? Where to go? Right above it. See that password with password hash? See how long that is? That's exactly what we were looking for. Bingo. So now let me execute this script. Commands completed successfully, and if I refresh my logins, my test user and SQL test. Exactly what we need to do. So now we're able to migrate that database over, and the users won't be what's called orphaned. That's what the DBA term is an orphaned user when you migrate a database without migrating the security first. Great. Okay, let's go through an actual database migration. This is going to be pretty easy. You won't have that much trouble. There are a bunch of different ways to do this, though. So, and it all depends on what your needs are and what the application is. But in this basic scenario, we have a database. Data is not being actively written to it. So one of the easiest ways to do is I could simply take a database backup and then just restore that database back up on the new server. That would be an easy way. And the other way is I could physically move the database files themselves to the new server and then reattach it, which that's what we're going to do. So the first step is to make sure nothing can actually write to this database, and that's to just take it offline. Just turn that database off. And it's going to say, hey, you really want to do this? Yeah, I want to do that. Okay, great. See a little red X, now the database is offline. I can't even expand it anymore. This SQL Server is no longer actively accessing that database. So now what I want to do, now that we've taken it offline, we want to detach it. Do you want to detach it? Yep. All right. Now SQL Server doesn't even have access to the files themselves that were running that SQL Server. So these are virtual machines, so I'm just going to pull up Hyper-V real quick, and we're going to copy the database files to a file share where I can then go to the new server and copy them back to the new server. All right, let's get logged in. Excellent. I'll bring up my File Explorer. Let's go full screen on that. And this was under SQL data, right? We had a folder called databases. Yeah, I've got permission. Okay, so the two files that I need to copy, this is the database itself. This file is an MDF file. That is essentially just main database file. And then right below it, you can see the transaction log file. These are the two files that have got to get moved over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold them, and I'm going to actually cut. I'm going to put them on my file share just temporarily while it's being moved. I'm going to paste. Ah, no, Windows updates. They'll always find a way to squeeze their way in, huh? Okay, so now the database files themselves are on my file share. And note that had we not taken the database offline and attached it, this wouldn't have worked. These files would still be in access. It'd be like trying to move a text file that you have open right now. So now that is on the file share, let's hop on the new SQL Server and copy them to the new SQL Server. Okay, I'll go back to that file share. And I see my files. I'm going to cut them from the file share. And I'm going to browse to my SQL data folder. And I'm going to paste. Excellent. We can close that. Bring this back up. And since I'm done working on SQL Test 1, I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect it right there. And what I want to do now is to attach a database. I'm going to click on Databases. I'm going to right-click it, go to Attach. I'm going to click on Add, and check it out. It already knows to look in the default data location, which is E drive and then data. I'm going to pick my MDF file that we just talked about. That is the main database file. Click OK. And it's showing you, hey, this is the file that we're going to be importing here, as well as its log file going right there next to it. Super, that's what I want. Click OK. And look at that. We have now done it. Let's expand my tables. Let's see if I can query it. Boom. Database migration completed. Wow, this has been a big video. We covered SQL security, how that is important to migrate before doing a database migration, and then we accomplished a very simple database migration itself by detaching it from the old SQL Server and then reattaching it to the new SQL Server. In the next video, we're going to wrap up the SQL series with maintenance plans and database backups. It's going to be a big one too, but if you're in development and report writing, you may be thinking, I don't need this DBA stuff. Well, guess what? This is huge. This is wildly important stuff, especially if you want to keep those applications that you're developing up and running. All right, folks, get out there and try it out.